Patrick Bellamy was 36 years old when he came home on a Friday evening to find his wife standing in the doorway with his duffel bag already packed and waiting at her feet. No fight, no warning, just 4 words, flat and final. Pack your bags, Patrick. He stood on the porch of the home he thought was solid, holding a bag he hadn't packed, watching the woman he loved look at him like a stranger. He didn't know yet that she had spent the last 3 weeks finding out exactly who he really was. He didn't know that in less than 10 minutes, 3 black SUVs would roll into that driveway carrying a man who had been quietly helping her build the case that was about to end his life as he knew it.
Before we get into it, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from today. And if revenge stories like this one move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story might be the one that breaks the internet.
Now let's continue the story. Renata Bellamy had always believed that you could tell everything about a man by the way he came home. Some men walked through the door already arguing with the day they'd had. Some men walked through the door and left the day at the threshold, like wiping their shoes. For 10 years, Patrick had always been the second kind. That was part of why she married him. That Friday morning started ordinary, the way the worst days always do. She was up before him, moving through the kitchen in the gray dark before sunrise, the coffee maker hissing soft behind her. She had a meeting that afternoon with a new client, a restaurant group looking to redesign 3 locations, and she'd been up late the night before sketching concepts at the kitchen table, the good kind of tired that came from work she actually loved. Patrick came downstairs already dressed, jacket over his arm, moving faster than usual. "You're out early," she said, not turning around yet. "Early walkthrough on the Caldwell project," he said. "Investor wants to see the framing before the city inspector comes through." She nodded, poured his coffee into the travel mug he liked, the navy one with the chip in the handle. He took it from her without quite meeting her eyes, the way he'd been doing for a while now, without her fully letting herself notice. She'd told herself it was stress. The company had grown fast this year, 3 new contracts at once, more pressure than Bellamy Construction had ever carried before. Stress did things to a man's eyes, made them slide past you toward whatever was waiting on his phone screen instead. "I'll be late tonight," he said, keys already in hand. "Don't wait up." "Okay," she said. He kissed the top of her head, quick, already halfway out the door by the time his lips left her hair. The door clicked shut behind him. She stood in the kitchen a moment longer, holding her own coffee, looking at the space where he'd just been standing. She had not always been the kind of woman who checked. She wanted to say that about herself honestly, even now, even after everything. She had built her whole marriage on the belief that trust was a thing you gave freely or you didn't give a marriage at all. But 3 weeks ago, something small and stupid had cracked that belief wide open. And once it cracked, she hadn't been able to look away from what was underneath. It started with a parking receipt. She'd been doing laundry, going through Patrick's jacket pockets out of habit before she ran it through the wash, and a small folded slip of paper had fallen out onto the laundry room floor. A parking garage downtown, a date stamped on it from 2 weeks back, a time, 11:47 p.m. Patrick had told her that night he was at a site walkthrough that ran late. The garage on the receipt wasn't anywhere near any of his job sites. It was 3 blocks from the Marchetti Hotel, the boutique one downtown with the rooftop bar that Renata had always wanted to try and never gotten around to. She'd stood in the laundry room holding that small piece of paper for a long time, telling herself there were 100 reasonable explanations. A client dinner, a meeting that ran over. She'd folded the receipt back up and put it in her own pocket instead of his, and she hadn't said a word. That was the moment, looking back, when everything started to change in her, quiet and careful, the way water finds a crack in a foundation and starts working it wider without ever making a sound you can hear from inside the house. She started noticing things she'd been letting herself not notice. The way Patrick had started taking calls out on the back porch instead of in the kitchen, sliding the door shut behind him. The way his phone, which used to sit face up on the counter without a second thought, now lived face down and had grown a passcode sometime in the last few months that he'd never had before. The way he came home some nights smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't hers, something floral and expensive, gone again by the time she could be sure she'd actually smelled it at all. She didn't confront him. Not yet. Some instinct in her, old and careful, told her that a woman who confronts too early only teaches a guilty man to hide better. So instead, she watched. She waited. And she called the one person she trusted enough to help her figure out if she was losing her mind or finally seeing clearly for the first time in months. Yvette Carmichael answered on the second ring, the way she always did, like she kept her phone in her hand specifically for Renata's emergencies. "Talk to me," Yvette said. She'd been Renata's best friend since design school, sharp-tongued and steady. The kind of friend who told you the truth even when the truth cost something. Renata told her everything. Sitting in her car in the parking lot outside her own studio, engine off, hands cold around the steering wheel. The receipt. The locked phone. The late nights that didn't match his stories. The perfume that lingered just long enough to be real and just briefly enough to make her doubt herself. Yvette was quiet a moment when she finished. "How long has this been sitting on you?" 3 weeks, Renata said. I didn't want to say it out loud. Saying it out loud makes it real. "It's already real, Nadia," Yvette said, gentle but firm. "Whether you say it or not." Renata closed her eyes. "I don't want to be the woman who blows up her marriage over a parking receipt." "You're not blowing up anything," Yvette said. "You're finding out the truth. There's a difference between burning a house down and checking if it's already on fire." A pause. "I know somebody. A private investigator, does discreet work, mostly for women in exactly your situation. Costs money, but it's quiet, and it's thorough. You don't make a single move until you actually know what you're dealing with." Renata sat with that a long moment, looking out the windshield at nothing. "Send me his number." The investigator's name was Dorian Lattimore, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who'd spent 20 years in corporate fraud investigation before going independent. He met Renata at a coffee shop 2 towns over, far enough from her usual circles that nobody would recognize her, and listened to everything she had, without writing a single note until she finished. "I can tell you in 2 weeks whether there's something here worth your attention," he said. "I want to be honest with you up front. Sometimes there's nothing. Sometimes a man's just stressed and careless and none of it means what you're afraid it means. And sometimes," Renata asked. "Sometimes there's everything," Dorian said. "I won't know which one this is until I look." She hired him that afternoon. She told herself, driving home, that she was doing this so she could stop being afraid, one way or another. She did not yet understand that the truth Dorian was about to hand her would be so much larger than the question she'd actually asked him. The first thing Dorian found wasn't about another woman at all. It was about money. He called Renata 8 days into the investigation, his voice careful in the particular way of a man who has done this enough times to know that bad news lands better delivered slow. "I need you to sit down for this," he said. She was already sitting, at her studio desk, the door locked, the blinds drawn the way she'd started keeping them lately. Whenever she needed to take a call, she didn't want overheard. "Go ahead." "Bellamy Construction has 3 active accounts," Dorian said. "Operating, payroll, and a reserve account your husband set up about 18 months ago that doesn't show up on the quarterly summaries he's been giving you." Renata's stomach went tight and cold. "I don't understand. I see the books every quarter. He goes over everything with me. He goes over what he wants you to see," Dorian said gently. "The reserve account's been receiving transfers from the operating account at irregular intervals for the last 14 months. Small at first, a few thousand here and there. Easy to explain away as equipment costs or contractor advances. Over the last 6 months, the transfers have gotten bigger and more frequent." "How much?" Renata said. It wasn't really a question. It was a brace. As of last week's statement, just under $210,000 has moved through that reserve account, Dorian said. And from there, in 3 separate transfers over the last 4 months, money has gone out to a property management company downtown. Earnest money and closing costs on a condominium in the Hartwell building. Renata sat very still, the phone pressed hard against her ear, the studio around her gone suddenly distant, like she was hearing all of this from underwater. "He bought a condo," she said slowly. "It closed 6 weeks ago," Dorian said. "It's not in his name directly. It's held under a holding company, Crestline Properties LLC, registered to an address that traces back to a registered agent service, the kind people use when they don't want their name easy to find attached to something." "Is my name on that company anywhere? Any of the company's money? Anything that's supposed to be mine too?" "No," Dorian said, "which is part of why I wanted you sitting down. Renata, this isn't a man being careless with a parking receipt. This looks like a man who's been quietly building a second life for over a year, funded by money that by every account should belong to both of you. or at minimum, should belong to the business you've both put your name behind. Renata closed her eyes. The hurt was there, sharp and real, but underneath it, something else was rising too, something colder and steadier. The same feeling she got at the start of a big design project when the chaos of an empty space first started resolving itself into a plan. Find out who's living in that condo with him, she said. I want a name. Already working on it, Dorian said. Give me 4 more days. The 4 days felt longer than the 3 weeks before them combined. Renata moved through her life on the surface like nothing had changed. Client meetings, dinner on the table, conversation with Patrick about ordinary things, the renovation timeline, his mother's upcoming birthday, what they should plant in the side garden come spring. Underneath all of it, she felt herself becoming someone new, someone who watched everything now with a second set of eyes, cataloging, comparing, looking for the cracks she'd missed for over a year because she hadn't wanted to find them. She started her own quiet research too, in the gaps between Dorian's updates. She pulled the business's tax filings from the last 2 years, comparing them against the casual quarterly summaries Patrick had been giving her at the kitchen table, the ones she'd trusted without question because trusting him had never once cost her anything before. The numbers in the filings and the numbers he'd told her never quite matched. Not enough to be obvious if you weren't looking. Exactly enough to hide $200,000 from a wife who loved you too much to check. She thought about her own mother during those 4 days more than she had in years. Her mother had stayed in a marriage that had hollowed itself out long before anyone had the courage to say so out loud, had absorbed every quiet betrayal, because leaving felt like the bigger failure. Renata had promised herself as a girl that she'd never build a life on a foundation she was too afraid to look at directly. She was looking at it now. Every crack, every load-bearing lie. Dorian called again on a Tuesday evening, while Patrick was out at what he'd called a late-sight meeting that Renata now understood, with a kind of tired, hollow certainty, was almost never actually a sight meeting at all. Her name is Camille Ashworth, Dorian said. 29. She works as an event coordinator for a hospitality group downtown. The condo lease and several joint expenses, furniture deliveries, a car payment, all trace back to the same Crestline account your husband's been feeding. Renata sat with the name a moment. Turning it over like a stone, she was checking for sharp edges. How long? Best estimate, based on the timeline of the transfers and some social activity I was able to verify, is somewhere around 14 months, Dorian said. There's more, Renata. I want to tell you because I think you'd rather know than not know, even though it's not going to be easy to hear. Tell me. She's pregnant, Dorian said quietly. A little over 4 months along, from what I could confirm through a mutual contact at her workplace. It's being treated, as far as I can tell from how openly she's discussing it, as a confirmed and welcomed pregnancy. Not a secret she's keeping. A future she believes is already decided. Renata sat in the dark of her own kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, and felt something in her chest go very quiet. The particular quiet that comes after the worst of the pain has already landed, and what's left behind is just clarity, cold and clean. Thank you, Dorian, she said. I need everything documented. Every transfer, every date, the lease, the company filing, all of it, organized the way it would need to look in front of a lawyer. I'll have the full file to you by Friday, Dorian said. Renata, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. I don't say that to every client. Most of the time, I'm just delivering information. This one, I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, Renata said, surprising herself with how steady her own voice came out. Be thorough. That's worth more to me right now than sympathy. She ended the call and sat in the dark kitchen a long time after, the phone heavy and cold in her lap. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice and went quiet. Somewhere down the block, a car door shut. Ordinary sounds, the kind that usually meant nothing at all, and yet tonight every one of them landed against her like a small separate blow, proof that the world kept moving even while hers had just been pulled out from under her feet. She thought about the night Patrick proposed, down on one knee in the parking lot of the restaurant where they'd had their first date, too impatient to wait for somewhere fancier, too sure of what he wanted to dress the moment up in anything but plain honesty. She had believed him then. She had believed him every year since. Through the lean years when Bellamy Construction was just him and a borrowed truck. Through the year they lost a pregnancy of their own and grieved it quietly together at this same kitchen table. Through every ordinary Tuesday that had added up, brick by brick. into something she'd been foolish enough to call solid. A baby. He was having a baby with another woman, funded by money he'd stolen from the both of them, while Renata had spent that same stretch of months wondering, privately, and with no one to tell, whether her own body would ever let her try again. She let herself cry for exactly 10 minutes by the clock on the stove, because she'd promised herself she wouldn't let this swallow more of her time than that. Not tonight. Not when there was still so much work ahead of her. Then she wiped her face, refilled her glass of water, and went back to the legal pad where she'd already started a list in her own neat, careful handwriting. Things I know. Things I need. Things I am no longer afraid of. She wrote Camille's name at the top of the second column, under the heading Things I Need, and beneath it, everything. She didn't tell Patrick anything that week. She'd learned that much from Yvette, and from her own slow-building instinct, that the worst thing she could do now was let him see the storm coming before she was ready for it to break. Instead, she made a phone call she hadn't expected to make in this lifetime, to a man she'd worked with 18 months earlier on a hospitality renovation project, back before any of this had started, back when her biggest professional worry had been whether a client would approve her tile selection on time. Desmond Jones had been the lead investor on that project, a logistics and real estate magnate who'd taken an immediate, almost paternal interest in Renata's work the moment he saw her first concept boards. He'd told her once, half joking, that if she ever needed anything, professionally or otherwise, she should call him directly instead of going through his assistant. She hadn't expected to ever need to take him up on that. But Bellamy Construction, she now understood with growing dread, had bid on a contract 3 months back for one of Desmond's commercial properties. A contract Patrick had been quietly courting using numbers and project timelines that Renata, looking back now with new eyes, suspected were inflated to cover the holes the embezzlement had been carving into the business's real financial health. She needed to know if that contract was still moving forward. She needed to know exactly how much exposure Desmond's company had to whatever came crashing down once this all became public. And, if she was honest with herself, she needed to talk to someone outside the wreckage of her own life who could see the whole shape of the problem clearly. Desmond listened to her on the phone for nearly 20 minutes without interrupting once. "I want to come to you," he said finally, his voice carrying the particular calm of a man who had handled enormous problems before and didn't waste energy panicking over new ones. "Today, if you're able. Some things are better discussed in person, and I think you deserve to not be carrying this entirely alone for one more afternoon." "You don't have to do that," Renata said. "I'm aware I don't have to," Desmond said. "I'm choosing to. You finished a renovation for my company that came in under budget and ahead of schedule when 3 other firms told me it couldn't be done. I don't forget people who do right by me, Renata, especially not when I find out the world's been doing wrong by them." He arrived at her house just after 5 that afternoon, 3 black SUVs pulling into the driveway in tight, deliberate formation, security stepping out first to scan the quiet residential street before Desmond himself emerged, tall and unhurried in a charcoal suit. Exactly the kind of presence that made a quiet street feel suddenly, electrically alert. What Renata didn't yet know, standing in her doorway watching the convoy arrive, was that Patrick had come home early that same afternoon, a rare break in his schedule, and had pulled into the driveway himself not 10 minutes earlier, parking on the street instead of in the driveway, because Renata's car was already there and he hadn't wanted to box her in. He was standing in the front hallway, halfway through taking off his jacket, when he heard the engines outside and looked out the window to see 3 SUVs he didn't recognize rolling to a stop at the end of his own driveway. Renata met Desmond at the door before Patrick could reach it, something tight and urgent in the look she gave him that told him, without words, to let her handle the first part of this conversation. "Mr. Jones," Patrick said, stepping into the hallway behind her, his voice carrying the forced pleasantness of a man trying to assess a threat he didn't yet understand the shape of. "This is a surprise. We don't have a meeting scheduled, do we?" "No," Desmond said evenly, his eyes moving briefly past Patrick to Renata, something steady and watchful in them. "This isn't a business visit, Patrick." "Not exactly." Patrick's smile flickered, just slightly, the first crack of genuine uncertainty showing through. "Then what is it?" "It's a conversation your wife and I started a few days ago," Desmond said, "about the bid your company submitted for my Lansing Street property. About the financials behind it. About some things that came up while she was looking closer at her own company's books that I think concern more than just the two of you." Patrick's eyes shot to Renata, and Renata watched something happen across his face in real time. The slow understanding of a man realizing the ground he thought was solid had been quietly hollowed out beneath him for longer than he knew. "Renata," he said carefully. "What's going on?" "You should pack a bag," Renata said. Her voice was steady. She'd practiced this moment in her head more times than she could count over the last week. And now that it was finally here, she found she didn't need the practice at all. The words came out clean and certain, like something that had always been true and was only now being said out loud. "I want you out of this house tonight." "You can't be serious," Patrick said. "Renata, whatever this is, whatever you think you found, let's talk about it. Just the two of us." "I'm done talking, just the two of us," Renata said. "I spent 14 months talking to you while you were lying to my face every single day. I think I've earned a different conversation now." She glanced at Desmond, a small, deliberate nod passing between them. "One with witnesses." Patrick looked between his wife and the man standing calm and immovable in his doorway. Security fanned out discreetly behind him near the SUVs, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Patrick Bellamy understood, with a cold drop in his stomach, that he was no longer the one controlling the shape of this story. Desmond didn't stay long that first evening. He'd come, he explained once they were seated in the living room. Patrick pale and silent on the edge of the armchair, Renata composed on the couch with her hands folded tight in her lap, mostly to confirm something he'd suspected since Renata's call that morning, and to make sure she wasn't facing the next part of this alone. "I've put a hold on the Lansing Street contract," Desmond said, looking at Patrick directly now, "pending a full review of Bellamy Construction's financials. I won't pretend that's a small thing for your business, Patrick, and I won't pretend I take any pleasure in saying it. But I have a responsibility to my own investors, and I can't move forward with a partner whose books may not hold up to the kind of scrutiny this is clearly headed toward." Patrick's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about my books." "I know your wife hired a forensic specialist 3 weeks ago," Desmond said evenly. "I know that specialist found a reserve account that doesn't appear on the summaries you've been giving her. I know that account fed a property purchase under a holding company that isn't in either of your names." He let that sit a moment, watching it land. "I don't need to know everything yet, Patrick. I know enough to be concerned, and concern is enough for me to pause a multi-million-dollar contract until the picture's clearer." Patrick's eyes went to Renata, something desperate creeping into them now, the first real fear Renata had seen on his face since this all started. "You hired someone to investigate me?" "I hired someone to investigate the truth," Renata said. "It's not my fault you didn't want me to find it." "Renata, please," Patrick said, his voice dropping, the anger draining out of it fast now, replaced by something closer to pleading. "Whatever you found, it's not as bad as it looks. I can explain the account, I can explain the property, just give me a chance to." "Camille Ashworth," Renata said. The room went very quiet. Patrick's face did something complicated, the practiced composure he'd been holding for months finally cracking open all the way, and underneath it was something Renata almost didn't want to see, because some small foolish part of her had still been hoping, until this exact second, that there might be an innocent explanation for a name like that. There wasn't. She could see it plain on his face. There never had been. "How long?" she said quietly. "And don't lie to me. Not anymore. There's nothing left to protect by lying." Patrick sat with his head in his hands a long moment before he answered. 14 months, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Renata, I never meant for it to go this far. It started small, I swear to you. It started as something I told myself didn't mean anything, and then you bought her a condo with money you stole from our business," Renata said, her voice still calm, still even, though something underneath it now had gone sharp as glass. "And then you got her pregnant, and you kept coming home every night and kissing me on the top of my head like none of that was happening on the other side of this city." Patrick's head came up fast. "How do you know about?" "I know everything, Patrick," Renata said. "That's the part you never accounted for. You built this whole second life assuming I'd never look hard enough to see it. You were wrong." Desmond rose from his seat, buttoning his jacket with the unhurried precision of a man who had said everything he'd come to say. "I'll leave you two to finish this conversation," he said. "Renata, my offer still stands. Whatever you need moving forward, legal counsel, a place to think, anything at all. You call me directly. Thank you, Desmond, Renata said. Truly. He paused at the door, looking back at Patrick with something almost like pity, the kind a powerful man reserves for someone who has thrown away something valuable through nothing but his own carelessness. Pack the bag, Patrick, he said quietly. Tonight. I'd start there if I were you. The SUVs pulled away into the dark a few minutes later, leaving the house in a silence that felt, to Renata, heavier than anything she'd experienced in the 3 weeks since the parking receipt had first fallen out of his jacket pocket. Patrick packed a bag that night and left for a hotel without much more fight in him, the air gone out of whatever defense he'd been holding onto since the SUVs first rolled into the driveway. Renata watched him go from the front window, the same window she'd stood at 1,000 evenings before this one, waiting for his truck to pull in safe and ordinary, never once imagining a night like this one waiting somewhere down the road. She didn't cry until his taillights disappeared around the corner. Then she sat down on the bottom stair of the house they'd built a life in together and let herself feel every bit of it, all at once, for the first time since this whole thing started. In the morning, she had work to do. Yvette arrived before 9 the next morning with 2 coffees and a legal pad, setting both down on the kitchen table without asking whether Renata wanted company. Some friendships didn't require the asking. Dorian's full file came in late last night, Renata said, sliding her laptop across the table. Everything. The transfers, the LLC filing, the lease, copies of the closing documents on the condo. Yvette scanned through it, her expression hardening with every page. This isn't just a man cheating, Renata. This is fraud. He used business funds, funds that belong to a company you co-own on paper even if you haven't been active in day-to-day operations, to finance an entire second household. That's not just a marriage problem. That's a legal problem, and depending on how the business is structured, it might be a criminal one too. I know, Renata said. I want to do this right. Not just angry. Right. Then we start with a forensic accountant who can put together a formal audit, Yvette said, already writing. Not just Dorian's preliminary work, something that'll actually hold up if this ends up in front of a judge or in front of the IRS, depending on how he's been reporting these transfers. And we need a family law attorney who specializes in business assets, somebody who can move fast on an asset freeze before he has the chance to start moving money around now that he knows you're looking. He doesn't know how much I know, Renata said. Not the full picture. He thinks I know about the condo and Camille. He doesn't know I have all of this. She gestured at the laptop. I want to keep it that way as long as possible. Yvette looked up at her, something like real respect moving across her face. You've been thinking about this for a while. 3 weeks, Renata said. Every night since that receipt fell out of his jacket. I had a lot of time to think about what I wanted to do once I knew for sure. The forensic accountant's name was Patricia Vance, a sharp, unhurried woman who came recommended by Renata's family law attorney, a tall, composed woman named Sheila Scott whom Yvette had worked with on a previous case years back. Patricia spent 4 days going through Bellamy Construction's full financial history, building on Dorian's initial findings with the kind of exhaustive, document-by-document thoroughness that left no question unanswered. The picture's even worse than your investigator found, Patricia told Renata during their second meeting, spreading printouts across the conference table in Sheila's office. The $210,000 he moved into the reserve account is just what fed the condo purchase. There's another $40,000 spread across smaller transfers over the same period, cash withdrawals mostly, that don't have a clear destination yet. Gifts, possibly. Travel. I need more time to trace it all the way down. Take the time, Renata said. I want the full picture before I do anything else. Sheila reviewed the asset freeze paperwork with Renata line by line, walking her through exactly what filing it would mean. Once this goes through, Patrick can't move money out of any account connected to the business or your shared finances without it showing up immediately, Sheila explained. He'll be notified, eventually, but by the time he is, everything will already be locked down. Do it, Renata said. There's something else you should consider, Sheila said carefully. Given the scale of what Patricia's found, and the way these funds were moved to avoid detection, you may have grounds here for more than a civil settlement. This could rise to embezzlement, depending on how Bellamy Construction is legally structured and whether any other investors or partners were defrauded along with you. If you want, I can loop in a colleague who handles white-collar criminal referrals. Renata thought about Patrick's face in the living room 2 nights earlier, the way he'd asked for a chance to explain, like 14 months and $250,000 and a baby on the way were things a few careful sentences could undo. Loop them in, Renata said. I want this done completely, not halfway. Sheila studied her a moment, the kind of look a woman gives another woman when she's checking whether the resolve in front of her is real or just the first hot rush of anger that tends to cool by morning. You sure? Once that referral goes in, this stops being something you can quietly walk back if you change your mind. I'm not going to change my mind, Renata said. I spent 3 weeks being scared I was wrong about all of this. I'm not scared anymore. I'm just clear. All right then, Sheila said, and there was something almost like respect in it now. Clear is good. Clear is what wins these. That evening, alone in the house that no longer felt entirely like hers, Renata walked slowly through each room the way she sometimes walked a client's space before starting a design, noting what worked and what didn't, what could stay and what needed to be stripped down to the studs and built again from nothing. The living room still held the couch they'd picked out together their second year of marriage, back when neither of them had $2 extra to rub together, and the secondhand sectional from a thrift shop downtown had felt like a small miracle. The hallway still held the photographs, their wedding, a trip to the coast, Patrick laughing with his head thrown back in a way that used to make her laugh too, helplessly, just from watching him. She stopped in front of one photograph in particular, the two of them on the porch the week they'd closed on this house. Patrick's arms slung easy around her shoulders, both of them too young and too broke and too in love to understand yet what either of those words would eventually cost. She did not take the photograph down. Not yet. There would be time for that later, once the legal machinery had done its work, once there was nothing left to decide except how to build the rest of her life without him in it. Tonight she only looked at it a long moment, let herself feel the full weight of what had been real in that photograph alongside everything that had turned out, underneath it, to be a lie. Then she turned off the hallway light and went to bed alone in a house that, piece by piece, document by document, she was already learning to make entirely her own again. Patrice Bellamy, Patrick's mother, called Renata the following week, her voice careful and unsteady on the line. I heard, Patrice said, not bothering to soften it. From Patrick, though I had to drag most of it out of him. I want you to know, Renata, I am not calling to defend my son. I appreciate that, Renata said. His father did something similar to me. Patrice said, the words clearly costing her something even now, decades later. Not identical, but close enough in shape that I recognized what you must be feeling the moment Patrick told me. I stayed. I told myself I stayed for the family, for the appearance of something whole, and I watched it cost me pieces of myself I never fully got back. A pause. I don't want that for you. Whatever you decide to do, I want you to know you have my support, not his. Renata felt something unexpected loosen in her chest at that, a kind of grief she hadn't known she was carrying for the relationship she'd built with this woman over 10 years of holidays and ordinary Sunday dinners. Thank you, Patrice. That means more than you know. There's something else, Patrice said. Something Patrick doesn't know I know. His father left a piece of property when he passed, a small commercial building downtown that's been sitting under a property management company, mostly forgotten, generating rental income nobody's been tracking closely. I believe Patrick has been quietly using that income too, separate from anything you've found so far. I can get you the documentation if it would help. Renata wrote it down on the legal pad in front of her, underlining it twice. It would help enormously. The invitation arrived 9 days later, a cream envelope with Renata's name in clean formal lettering. Desmond's annual investor gala, held each year at the Holloway Grand downtown, the kind of event that drew every major name in the city's real estate and construction circles into one glittering room for a single night. Renata had assumed, given everything, that her invitation would be quietly withdrawn this year. Instead, Desmond called her himself. I want you there, he said. Not just as my guest. I'd like you to present the concept work you did for the Lansing Street lobby redesign to the full investor group. The contract with Bellamy Construction is finished, but the work you did on the design was exceptional, and I think it's worth showing people exactly what you're capable of, independent of anything to do with him. Renata sat with that offer a long moment. Patrick will be there. He's still listed as a vendor on file, isn't he? Until the contract's formally terminated? He'll be there, Desmond confirmed. Along with, I'm told, Miss Ashworth. He apparently intends to introduce her publicly this year, now that the affair's no longer something he's bothering to hide. His voice hardened slightly. If that troubles you, Renata, say the word, and I'll have him removed from the guest list entirely, contract or no contract. Renata thought about it, really thought about it, turning the idea over the way she turned over a difficult design problem, looking for the angle that made the whole picture finally make sense. No, she said finally. Let him come. Let her come too. I have a few things to say to both of them, and I'd rather say them somewhere it can't be quietly swept under a rug afterward. The Holloway Grand's ballroom rose 3 stories at the center. Chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls of light, the kind of room Renata had designed dozens of spaces to imitate without ever quite matching the real thing. She arrived in deep emerald, structured and sharp through the shoulders, her hair swept back clean, a single gold bracelet on her wrist, the only jewelry she wore. She looked exactly like what she was that night, a designer presenting her work to a room full of people who mattered, not a wounded wife looking for a scene. Patricia Vance's full audit sat finished in Sheila's office, a complete and devastating accounting of 14 months of theft and deception, every transfer dated and traced, the rental income from Raymond Bellamy's forgotten building folded in alongside everything else Patrice had helped uncover. Sheila herself was present at the gala that evening too, seated quietly near the back of the room with a leather folder resting on her lap, waiting. Renata found Desmond near the entrance, and the two of them moved through the crowd together, Renata noting, out of old habit, every detail of the room's lighting and flow the way she always did in a space like this. The uplighting along the east colonnade is too warm, she murmured. Makes every face under it look a little orange in photographs. Desmond glanced up, amused despite the tension clearly sitting underneath the evening for both of them. I'll mention it to the planning team. You don't have to, she said. It's not my building. Not yet, anyway. Funny you should say that, Desmond said, something almost like a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth, though he didn't elaborate further, and Renata let it pass, her mind too full of what was coming to chase the thread. She spotted Patrick across the room 20 minutes later, near the bar, dark suit, the gold cufflinks she'd given him for their 8th anniversary, catching the chandelier light. He was laughing at something, head tilted back, the same easy, practiced laugh he used at every company function they'd ever attended together. He hadn't seen her yet. Then Camille arrived through the main doors in deep red, the soft curve of her pregnancy visible now beneath the fabric, moving through the entrance with the kind of careful confidence of a woman who believed, completely, that she belonged exactly where she was standing. Patrick crossed the room toward her in a dozen quick steps, kissed her cheek, turned to introduce her to 2 men standing nearby, his hand settling at the small of her back. Claiming, presenting. Renata watched it happen from across the room, her face giving nothing away, and felt something in her chest settle into place, cold and certain and finally, blessedly, ready. That's when Patrick turned and saw her. His face went through it in stages, the way she'd known it would. First confusion, a half-second of genuine surprise at seeing her here at all. Then recognition of exactly what her presence in this room, on this night, in front of these particular people, was likely to mean. Then something that almost looked like fear, quickly smoothed over by the practiced composure of a man used to talking his way out of difficult rooms. He started toward her across the floor. Renata didn't move to meet him halfway. She let him come to her, the same way she'd let him come to the front door 3 weeks ago, not knowing it would be the last time he walked through it as her husband. Renata, he said, low, urgent, glancing around at the gathering crowd nearby. What are you doing here? Working, she said simply. Desmond asked me to present the Lansing Street designs tonight. You remember Lansing Street? The contract you bid on using numbers that didn't add up, paid for partly with money you stole from our business. His jaw tightened. Not here. Why not here? Renata said, her voice carrying just enough to draw a few curious glances from nearby, though she kept it short of a scene, controlled, deliberate. You weren't worried about an audience when you brought Camille to a company event with your hand on her back, like she's something you're proud of. I think an audience is exactly where this belongs. Camille appeared at Patrick's side then, her smile faltering as she took in the tension between them, her hand moving instinctively to rest on the curve of her stomach. Patrick, who is this? The room around them seemed to tilt slightly, a few more heads turning now, the particular gravity of a public moment building before it breaks. "Camille," Renata said, before Patrick could find words. "I'm Renata Bellamy, Patrick's wife." She let that land fully before continuing. "I imagine he's told you a story about us. I guess it involves a marriage that was already over in every way that mattered, long before you came along. I want you to know that's not true. We were married, present tense. The entire time, he was building a life with you on money that wasn't his to spend." Camille's face went pale, her eyes flying to Patrick. "You told me you were separated. You told me the papers were already filed." "They weren't," Renata said quietly. And for the first time that evening, something in her voice softened, not for Patrick, but for the woman standing in front of her, clearly as deceived in her own way as Renata had been in hers. "I'm sorry you're finding this out like this. You deserved better than the story he gave you too." "Don't," Patrick said, low and urgent, stepping half between them like he could physically block the rest of this conversation from happening. "Renata, this isn't fair to her. She's pregnant. Whatever you're angry about with me, it doesn't have to involve her." "I'm not angry at her," Renata said, and meant it, looking past him to meet Camille's eyes directly. "I'm angry at you. I came over here because she's standing next to you with her hand on her stomach, believing she's about to build a life with an honest man. And I think she's earned the chance to know exactly what kind of man that actually is before she gets in any deeper." Camille's hand tightened against the curve of her belly, her gaze swinging slow and hard toward Patrick now, something shifting fast behind her eyes, disbelief curdling fast into the first cold edge of suspicion. "The condo," she said quietly. "You told me your business was doing well. You told me that money was clean." "It was complicated," Patrick started. "That's not an answer," Camille said. The small crowd of onlookers nearby had gone very quiet now, the particular silence of people pretending not to listen while listening with everything they had. Renata felt no satisfaction in that silence, not the kind she might have expected weeks earlier when she'd first imagined a moment like this one. What she felt instead was something steadier, the simple relief of finally saying a true thing out loud in a room where it could no longer be denied or explained away. Desmond appeared then, moving through the gathering crowd with quiet authority, Sheila a step behind him, leather folder now open in her hands. "Patrick," Desmond said, his voice carrying the easy command of a man used to rooms reorganizing themselves around him. "I think it's time we step somewhere more private to finish this conversation. There are some documents I'd like you to see before this evening goes any further." The private lounge off the Holloway Grand's East Corridor was quiet in the particular way of expensive rooms, thick carpet swallowing sound, heavy curtains drawn against the ballroom noise beyond. Sheila set the leather folder down on the long mahogany table at the center of the room and opened it without ceremony, pulling out a clean, tabbed stack of documents that Patricia Vance had spent 4 days assembling. Patrick sat across from it, his face gone gray, Camille beside him now, one hand pressed flat to her stomach, her eyes moving between the documents and Patrick's face like she was trying to find the version of him she thought she knew somewhere in the wreckage being laid out in front of her. "This is the forensic audit of Bellamy Construction's financial records over the last 18 months, Sheila said, sliding the first page across the table. Page 1 summarizes a total of $251,000 transferred out of business accounts into a holding company, Crestline Properties LLC, used to fund a residential property and ongoing personal expenses." She turned to the next page without pausing. Page 2 details an additional $38,000 in rental income from a commercial property inherited from your late father, income that should have been reported as a marital asset and was instead routed through a separate account your wife had no knowledge of. Patrick stared at the pages, his mouth opening and closing without finding words. "There are 17 separate transfers structured to stay under standard reporting thresholds," Sheila continued, her voice flat and clinical. "That's not carelessness, Patrick. That's a pattern. My colleague in white-collar litigation has already reviewed this file and believes there's a strong basis for a criminal referral, in addition to the asset recovery we'll be pursuing through the divorce proceedings." "This is insane," Patrick said, finally finding his voice, though it came out thin and unsteady. "Renata, you can't do this. We built that business together. You can't just—" "I built that business with you," Renata said, standing now, her voice even and clear. Past tense. You spent 14 months building something else entirely, in secret, with money that belonged to both of us. I'm not destroying anything, Patrick. I'm just finally looking at what you already destroyed and making sure you don't get to walk away from it clean. Desmond, standing near the door with his arms crossed, spoke for the first time since they'd entered the room. The Lansing Street contract is formally terminated, effective tonight. I'll also be sharing this audit with 2 other developers I know who've worked with your company recently, simply as a courtesy, so they can assess their own exposure. His voice was calm, final. I don't take pleasure in this, Patrick. But I built my reputation on not doing business with men who can't be trusted with someone else's money, and I intend to keep it that way. Camille stood up slowly from her chair, her hands still resting on her stomach, and looked at Patrick with an expression that had moved past hurt into something colder and more final. The condo, she said quietly. Tell me the truth. Where did the money for the condo actually come from? Patrick didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence answered for him, and Camille's face closed over like a door shutting. I need some air, she said, and walked out of the lounge alone, her heels fading down the quiet corridor, past the ballroom's glittering noise, past 200 guests who didn't know her name and never would. The weeks that followed moved with the particular grinding slowness of legal process, the unglamorous machinery that takes over once the dramatic confrontation is already finished. Renata had expected, in some small, foolish corner of herself, that exposing Patrick at the gala would feel like an ending. Instead, it felt like the start of something longer and more exhausting. Paperwork and depositions and careful conversations with attorneys who spoke a language she was slowly, grimly learning to translate for herself. The asset freeze held without issue, Patrick's accounts locked down before he'd had the chance to move anything further. The forensic audit, expanded over the following month by Patricia Vance's continued digging, eventually traced the full scope of what he'd taken. $289,000 across 18 months, funneled through Crestline Properties and a handful of smaller accounts, used to fund the condo, a leased car in Camille's name, and a string of trips and gifts that Renata read through once, fully, and then never let herself look at again. The criminal referral moved forward too, slower than the civil proceedings, but steady. A detective named Imani Carruthers assigned to the Financial Crimes Unit taking over the case with the same thorough patience Renata had come to recognize in everyone she'd assembled around herself these last 2 months. Cases like this take time, Detective Carruthers told her during one of their meetings, but the documentation your team put together is some of the cleanest I've worked with. Most embezzlement cases were fighting to establish intent. Here, the pattern of structuring those transfers to stay under reporting thresholds does most of that work for us already. Patrick's attorney pushed for a settlement rather than risk the case going further, and 6 weeks after the gala, the divorce settlement was finalized with terms that recovered nearly everything that had been taken. Bellamy Construction's remaining assets split in a way that left the business, what was left of it, fully in Renata's name going forward, debt-free, its reputation bruised but not beyond repair. Patrick pleaded to a reduced charge on the criminal side 8 weeks after that, the threat of a public trial clearly weighing heavier on him than the quiet humiliation of a deal. 18 months, suspended pending restitution, a number large enough that Renata understood, signing the final paperwork in Sheila's office on a gray Tuesday afternoon, that whatever life Patrick tried to build next would be built from very near the bottom, the same place he'd once told her, in the easy early years of their marriage, that he'd promised himself he'd never go back to. She didn't feel triumphant signing those papers. She felt, mostly, tired in a way that ran all the way down to her bones, the particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent months being strong because the alternative wasn't available to her. But underneath the tiredness, when she let herself actually sit with it, there was something else too. Something quieter and more durable. Relief. Clarity. The settled, certain feeling of a woman who had looked directly at the worst thing that had ever happened to her and had not looked away once, not even for a second, until it was finished. Patrice came by Renata's studio most weeks after that, never staying long, bringing coffee or a small plant or, once, a tin of pecan pralines she set on the front counter without explanation. She never asked about Patrick, and Renata never offered. They talked instead about the work, about the new clients coming in steadily now that word had quietly spread through the city's design circles about the woman who'd rebuilt her business from nothing after everything fell apart around her. "Your father would have been proud of this," Patrice said one afternoon, looking at the new logo Renata had designed for the studio's relaunch. Bellamy had been dropped from the name entirely, replaced with Carver Design Group, her mother's maiden name, a quiet reclaiming that had felt, the day Renata finalized it, like setting down a weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying. "I hope so," Renata said, and meant it. Desmond's Lansing Street project moved forward that spring under a new construction partner, but the lobby design stayed exactly as Renata had drawn it: warm concrete and brass fixtures, and natural light pouring through floor-to-ceiling glass in long pale bars across the floor. Desmond had insisted on that point firmly when he restructured the contract. The design was never the problem, he told her. The two of them standing in the half-finished lobby on a clear March morning, scaffolding still up along the east wall, the smell of fresh concrete heavy in the air. "I'm not about to lose good work because of the man who happened to bid the contract." Renata's studio had grown steadily through that winter and into spring, 3 new commercial clients signing on within weeks of each other, drawn in by the quiet, persistent reputation building around Carver Design Group, a firm whose principal had, as one client put it bluntly during their first meeting, clearly been through something and come out the other side sharper for it. She hired her first full-time associate in April, a young designer named Destiny Scott, Sheila's niece as it turned out, fresh out of school and hungry in the particular way Renata recognized from her own younger self, the version of her that had once believed good work alone could build a whole life, before she'd learned the harder lesson that good work had to be protected too, fiercely, by someone willing to look directly at the threats to it instead of away. "I want to ask you something," Destiny said one afternoon, the two of them reviewing material samples spread across the studio's work table. "Everyone in this business has a story about how they got their start. What's yours?" Renata considered the question a long moment, turning over how much of it she wanted to give to a young woman just beginning her own career, still mostly unbruised by the parts of this work that had nothing to do with design at all. "I started over," Renata said finally. "Completely. From something I thought was solid and turned out not to be." She picked up a swatch of warm gray fabric, turning it over in her hands. "The trick isn't avoiding that. Everybody's foundation gets tested eventually. The trick is making sure, when it happens, you're the one who decides what gets rebuilt and what gets left behind for good." A year to the day after the night Patrick left with a packed bag and 3 black SUVs idling in the driveway, Renata stood in the finished lobby of the Lansing Street Tower at 7 in the morning, before the building's first tenants had arrived for the day, the early light moving slow and gold across the polished concrete floor exactly the way she'd imagined it would, sketching the concept board late one night a lifetime ago. The directory panel near the entrance still smelled faintly of fresh adhesive, the glass not yet touched by a single fingerprint. Her studio's name was etched into it in clean, confident lettering. Carver Design Group, Lobby and Executive Interiors, floors 1 through 8. She stood there a long while, reading it twice, feeling the particular fullness of a morning that asked nothing more of her than to simply stand still and witness something she'd built with her own hands and her own name. Finally, completely hers. Desmond found her there a few minutes later, 2 coffees in hand, offering her one without a word. "It's good work," he said, looking up at the atrium ceiling rising 40 feet above them, the light catching the brass fixtures along the east wall exactly the way she'd designed them to. "I don't say that to be kind. I say it because it's true." "Thank you," Renata said. "For all of it. Not just this." She looked at him, something warm and grateful moving openly across her face now, a year out from the worst night of her life, finally able to feel gratitude without it being tangled up in grief. "I don't know that I would have made it through that night the way I did, without you showing up the way you did." "You would have," Desmond said simply. "I've watched you work for 2 years now, Renata. You were always going to make it through. I just made sure you didn't have to do it standing entirely alone." Renata looked back up at the rising glass and steel around her, 12 months of rebuilding folded into the quiet pride of that single, steady morning, and understood, standing there with the city waking up slow beyond the windows, that she had not simply survived what happened to her. She had built something better out of it, brick by brick, beam by beam. with her own two hands and her own name finally, fully, etched into the glass. If this story moved you the way it moved us telling it, drop a comment and let us know which moment hit hardest. And if you believe the truth always finds its way to the light eventually, hit subscribe, because there's another story waiting for you tomorrow, and trust me, you don't want to miss it.